If you haven't already done so, please answer our first poll question. And finally, I want to let everyone know we're recording this meeting, and we'll send out a recording link and presenter materials afterwards. So we're excited to have with us again today Robert Albright from the Collective Impact Forum. He gave a great introduction yesterday in the webinar session, and today he's going to spend time with us really digging into how we can make collective impact work. So I am going to, Robert, it looks like I may have turned off your microphone by accident, so please reconnect your microphone, and I'll go ahead and pull up your slide.
Thanks, Chad. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. It's great to talk to you today. For those of you that joined yesterday, thanks so much for joining again. And for those that were not on the line yesterday or did not hear the recording, it's great to have you on the line today. Just a little bit of introduction for those of you who were not on the line yesterday. I'm Robert Albright with the Collective Impact Forum, which is an online resource for practitioners and funders all over the country who are interested in addressing complex social issues through collective impact. And I'm just thrilled to be with you all again today, and just wanted to start off again by thanking Chad and Leslie and others who have invited me to speak. To get started, I wanted to first just share the results of that first poll so we know who is on the line. So I just shared the results there. It looks like similar to yesterday, about 60% or so of you are college, university staff, and we also have a few community-based organization staff and volunteers, which is great to see. And I'll go ahead. We have another poll we wanted to queue up, which I'll have Chad do as I'm showing you the agenda for today. The second poll question, which should have just popped up, this is just so we have a sense of how many of you did participate in yesterday's webinar. So if you get a chance, just as I'm walking through the agenda right now, would love to have you check either yes, you attended, or no, but you have viewed it afterwards, or you did not participate. It's certainly fine either way, but it's helpful for us to know as we think about how much of a refresher to give today to start off the conversation. So let me just step through the agenda, and then I'll show the results of that poll. So we'll do a little bit on around the getting started of collective impact. Some of this I shared yesterday, so we won't spend a lot of time here, but this will hopefully help frame the conversation a little bit as we dig into much more detail on these other topics, including the role of the backbone, how you structure collective impact, how you evaluate collective impact, and then how you engage the community. And then lastly, we often get questions about what is the role of funders in collective impact. And so we'll share a little bit around what we've seen of the specific roles that funders can play. So let me share this poll result first. And as I'm sharing this result, you can see that a good number of you were there yesterday. So that's great. 3/4 attended yesterday, and then one of you did not. So I'll share a little bit of a refresher, but we'll obviously spend most of the time on new content today. In the spirit of it being an interactive session, we have one other poll question, and then we'll actually queue up a video. So I'm going to ask Chad as I transition to the next screen, which right now shows this black box. Chad is going to queue up a video, and while you're watching this video, this is a different video from yesterday, but hopefully we'll give you a bit more flavor on what is collective impact and why these different practitioners have invested in it as an approach. So again, it's about a 2.5-minute video, and as you watch this video, Chad, if you'll queue up that third poll question, this is a similar question that we asked yesterday, but I'd love to know just in terms of stage of collective impact. We'll ask this one again as well, just so people can respond. So Chad, I'll go ahead and hit play on this.
Why collective impact? I'd like to say simply because it works, but really it's a framework and an approach that allows everyone to engage, and that is really critical when you think about sustained, scalable, systemic change.
Collective impact is, I think, a new way of thinking about how communities organize. and take action together for complex outcomes or complex issues.
You can only really accomplish what you see, and I think that's what collective impact does, is it gives you this much broader view of the issue around you than a traditional approach does. A traditional approach keeps you somewhat siloed. This broader view, while overwhelming often, still allows you to accomplish so much more, understand so much more.
The difference between collective impact and collaboration, I think, is there's a really strong sense of interdependence when you have shared goals and shared outcomes that you're working toward. It's not just that we have to work together, we have to make sure that all of our partners succeed along the way as well. Because if they don't succeed, then our initiative won't be successful.
So collective impact has made a huge difference for us in our state. It has been able to bring together state-level agencies that haven't really worked together on teen pregnancy prevention, as well as some nonprofit organizations and other partners, to really think about how can we change teen pregnancy in our state? How can we reduce it in a coordinated manner?
We're concerned about issues of income inequality, economic mobility, and ultimately a lot of issues around poverty. Poverty is extremely complex, and collective impact is a way to think about and break it down so that there's really a directional focus, bringing multiple stakeholders on a complex problem like poverty and economic mobility.
But it also puts the responsibility on the stakeholders to come up with solutions, to work together, to leverage resources in a way that they haven't and would not outside of collective impact.
For me, it's a totally different game, and I'm not very interested in being part of a collaborative, but I'm very excited about being part of a collective impact initiative.
We bring a passion to this work, and I think the framework of collective impact helps us to make that passion into an outcome.
Thanks for putting the video up there and switching back over to the slides. And as Chad is transitioning back over to the slides, I hope that video gave you all a bit of color as we've talked to different backbone leaders and funders and others who are investing in collective impact in terms of why they see that it's promising. And I hope today, when we think about the objectives yesterday, we're really to dig into on what is collective impact and a little bit around how it works. My hope today is that we really spend a lot more time on the how-to, and that you begin to understand more about what it takes to make collective impact work. Before I go into the slides, just to show the results of that last poll, so you all should see this on your screen. We've got about half of you have not yet initiated collective impact, and the other half are in the early years, which is pretty consistent with what we had yesterday, not surprisingly, so that's helpful to know. And a lot of the content in here is geared to people who might be right on the beginning stages, either just getting started or have not yet started a collective impact initiative. So that's helpful to know. So this is the only slide that will look consistent from yesterday, but I did want to have it as grounding in terms of what are the 5 conditions of collective impact. So this will either be a reminder for most of you or some helpful framing for those of you that are new to the concept and were not able to join yesterday. So just briefly, the 5 conditions again: common agenda, so a common understanding of the problem; shared measurement system, where you have a common list of indicators that you're using to drive action and learning. Thirdly, you have mutually reinforcing activities, which is essentially a coordinated set of activities, not everyone doing the same thing. You're certainly differentiated, but you're aware of what each other are doing, so that's certainly important. Continuous communication, where you have frequent and structured communication to build trust, which, as we've seen, is certainly critical both with the leadership of collective impact that they're communicating, but also that you're engaging the broader community. And then lastly, backbone support. And when we talked yesterday, I talked through these at a high level, and my hope today is that we'll get into much more detail as you think about the specifics of these 5 conditions. So one thing I wanted to talk about in more detail today is how collective impact differs from other forms of collaboration. Again, this was something we touched on briefly yesterday, but thought it would be helpful to provide a bit more detail on how maybe a joint project or a joint program might differ from something like collective impact. So as you look at this slide and think about maybe two organizations partnering on a joint project there on the left side of the screen. So this would typically be something that's short-term, maybe a one-time effort or a pilot. And as you look down the screen here in terms of who might be involved, it would probably be a select set of partners, and the time frame is probably pretty short. And that's consistent with joint programs as well, which is kind of the next type of collaboration that we see. The time frame might be a little bit longer, but again, you have a smaller set of partners and you're focusing on implementing a specific program. And then as you move further to the right, getting into strategic alliances and then collective impact, both of these efforts are inclusive in their scope, and they both have certainly a medium to long-term orientation. I think one thing that is unique about collective impact, as it was called out in the video, if you recall that Dan was one of the people that we interviewed, and he said that with collective impact, there's a strong sense of interdependence around shared goals. And I would say that is something that's unique about collective impact, is that not only is it long-term in nature, but there's a recognition of the kind of connections and interdependencies across organizations. And it certainly takes more of the system-wide view of solving the problem. So there's a lot on here to absorb, but I just wanted to talk through, again, to help orient you to how collective impact, how we see it as different from other forms of collaboration. This is one way to think about it. So another important thing around this topic of getting started that is important to think about is, how do you develop an effective common agenda, and what are the boundaries that you're going to set around that common agenda? And there's three key considerations here. One, it's important to think about what's in and what's out. And this really means, what are the boundaries for the specific issues or organizations or geographies that you're going to scope as part of a collective impact effort. And this doesn't always look the same in every situation. We have seen collective impact efforts that are in a specific city. We've seen them in a metro area. We've also seen them in a state or a collection of states, and even increasingly we're seeing it play out in other parts of the world where you have actually multiple countries engaging on an issue. I think we see more activity and more traction of the idea at a local level, but it certainly, you could imagine creating the boundaries much broader than that, but it certainly introduces other challenges in terms of coordination and alignment at that level. So what's in and what's out is important. The second consideration here is that there is no set playbook, meaning that you can't necessarily have the same approach that worked in, let's say, Georgia. Let's say, for example, you wanted to do something on teen pregnancy reduction. There was the woman who was interviewed from the teen pregnancy prevention work in Georgia. There's probably some very useful lessons learned on how they identified their common agenda. But if you were going to do that same effort in North Carolina, you couldn't follow her steps step by step. There would need to be some variation and some situation-specific judgment, which is also leads to this third point around it needing to be loosely defined and malleable, which means that because you're thinking about addressing a complex issue which involves multiple systems and multiple organizations, the boundaries are likely going to change over time. And that might mean that you need to bring in other issues or other organizations and think about how other systems connect. So another important thing to think about with collective impact is how it draws upon a range of different community assets. And this is a simplified look at the structure that we typically see with collective impact. So on the left, you have some sort of backbone staff, which could be an individual organization or multiple organizations that play a coordinating role. At the top there, you have the steering committee, which we see typically as a 20 to 30 person group of leaders that help guide the effort. And then you often have work groups that are organized around certain goals. And through those work groups, you're engaging partners and community members at different levels. And so more specifically, when you think about these different levels, the steering committee typically plays that overall vision and leadership role. The work groups are the ones that are really leading implementation, helping think about what are the indicators that we're going to track, what are the specific strategies that we want to hold ourselves accountable to as a collective. You can really think of these as kind of your action teams, or where a lot of the work happens. And then the partners and community members might be on working groups, or if they don't have the bandwidth to do that, you could reach out to them at different points throughout and engage a collective impact effort to ensure that their feedback is incorporated into the strategies and into the implementation plan. And then lastly, that the backbone, as I said before, plays this really important neutral coordinating role. So we'll talk through all of these levels in a bit more detail on the webinar today, but wanted to use this as a helpful orientation to the different community assets that collective impact draws on. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the backbone, and then after that I'm going to pause and see if you have any questions about these first two sections. And then as we're moving forward, I'm happy to take questions throughout, or like we did yesterday, I'm also happy to leave time at the end if you want to either unmute your line and ask a question or type your question in the chat box. You're welcome to. So let's talk a little bit more about the backbone. So there's a couple key functions that the backbone organization plays. One, they play an important role with steering committee leadership. So they set the agenda for steering committee meetings. They help facilitate those meetings. There's a lot of work that happens kind of before, during, and after meetings with this 20 to 30 person group. And there needs to be someone who is thinking about that. So this is a really important role or a function that the backbone plays. Secondly, there's this function around shared measurement, which includes data collection, analyzing indicators, really monitoring progress over time, and if it requires gathering data from multiple organizations, making sure that they have the capacity, that those partners have the capacity to gather that information. So that's a second function that's an important function that backbones play. A third function is working group support. If you recall on that earlier slide I shared where you had the steering committee and then below the steering committee you might have multiple working groups, there needs to be some sort of staffed resources that helps essentially play that coordinating and facilitating role both for the steering committee and for the working groups. So this requires setting agendas and preparing material for those meetings and conducting research as needed, and essentially helping with that communication flow both from the steering committee to the working groups and then vice versa from the working groups to the steering committee. You can imagine that if each working group had 7 to 10 people on it and you had multiple working groups, there's a lot of different people at the table at different tables, and it's helpful to have someone in a neutral coordinating role like the backbone that can keep all of those different stakeholders and perspectives coordinated. And then a fourth function that the backbone plays, which is also important, is external communications and engagement. So not only communicating within the steering committee and working group, but thinking about how information is shared more broadly with the community is certainly a critical topic, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail later. And then lastly, there's just a lot of logistical support and scheduling meetings and calls. And sometimes FSG, as a consulting firm who is one of the partners on the Collective Impact Forum where I work, FSG is sometimes brought in to play all 5 of these roles for a limited time, but we typically define success when we're working with organizations as ultimately we're trying to equip local organizations to play this role because it's a much more sustainable plan in the long term. A couple other thoughts on the backbone leadership role. There's some important skill sets here on the left which match up to the functions on the right. We were just talking about functions, but thinking specifically about the skills needed to fulfill those functions. So one is a strategic skill set. So this is not just a logistical role. You need to have someone who can recognize patterns and can help address areas of coordination or gaps. So that's one important skill set. Another important skill set is it needs to be someone who's a servant leader. So this is someone who really is willing to kind of lead from behind and not just be a command and control type of leader. If anyone is interested in this idea of servant leadership, we've done some additional research and writing on this topic around what we call system leadership. And if anyone is interested, I'm happy to share more resources on the topic. But it's not what you would typically think of as a very direct, making all the decisions type of leader. This is a much different type of leader. And then it also helps to have someone who can engage and organize community partners with tools and information. And then there's some misperceptions about this role as well. Some people think that the backbone just sets the agenda and drives all the solutions, or can be self-appointed, and these couldn't be further from the truth. And so it's often helpful to dispel some of these common misperceptions. I'm going to pause there for just a moment and see, does anyone have any questions about those first couple of concepts? I'll move fairly quickly through these next two sections because I want to make sure we have time at the end for general questions as well, but I'll pause for just a second to see if anyone has any questions. Okay, well, I'm going to spend just maybe 5 minutes on each of these next couple of topics. So on the structure of collective impact, yes. Oh, great. Yep. Okay, so I'll read this back out for those of you who have just dialed in and don't have it in front of you. So Chad was asking, where does financial management fall? It was mentioned in the external communications function. Maybe this is a bigger question about resourcing collective impact efforts that you'll discuss later. It's a good question. I think that well, there's a couple of ways to think about that, Chad. One is how do you fund actually the backbone role itself? And then there's the broader question of is there an overall kind of budget for bringing all the different stakeholders together, for aligning multiple budgets of multiple organizations? And so I think on the first part of that question, in terms of how the backbone is resourced, a lot of times we see that if it's a function that is played by an existing organization, they carve out existing resources for it. But we have also seen that some communities have said we need to have a dedicated new entity to play this role, in which case they actually make a request either from the local philanthropy community, or they find resources through local government to carve out funding for that. So that's kind of the financial piece on the backbone side. And then there's a broader question around kind of financial resource alignment of the initiative overall. And I think we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about structure and some of these other topics. Does that help? Great. Okay, and I apologize for those of you who didn't hear yesterday. I'm battling a cold, so I'm trying to speak as clearly and slowly as possible, but still having the lingering effects of a cold here. So another important topic around collective impact is how you structure the work. So this is a little bit more detail on the steering committee and the working groups. And I'm going to flip through these fairly quickly, but we'll share the slides afterwards. This shares a bit more detail around how you go about recruiting a steering committee. So it's helpful to have a set of criteria in terms of what you're looking for. So you want it to be, representative of the, diversity of your community, or you want certain issues or types of organizations reflected. It's important to be clear on what the roles are, and if you have time and bandwidth, also to conduct interviews with these steering committee members to understand what they see as success. So that's on the steering committee front. And then as you go down to the action level of these working groups, and again, if you have that picture in your mind of a steering committee with several working groups working below it, these are some responsibilities of that working group level. So they're helping with strategy and indicator development, supporting implementation, and then this point around leadership at the bottom of this slide is key because they're often the ones who can really play an important role in championing the effort with relevant stakeholders, and because they're in a lot of ways closer to the action and the work that's being done around a certain issue, they can really play an important role with aligning work to the overall collective impact efforts goals. And then these working group responsibilities are typically carried out by leadership and working group members. So typically there's 2 co-chairs, and then you have 7 to 10 members that are knowledgeable about the problem and might not be the kind of executive director level of an organization, but have a lot of authority and experience to be able to represent organizations and decisions. So it's important to think about the working group as people who can kind of get the work done, and it wouldn't just be your typical kind of blue ribbon task force where people just breeze in and out and don't actually do much. So a couple other thoughts on the working group front. So you can think about forming working groups as both art and science. So this is similar to what I was saying before about there's no just very clear rule book here. A lot of this implies that you have to be pretty flexible and adaptable. So there is some science with selecting working group members. So being clear on what the scope of the problem is, understanding what existing coalitions are out there that you can build from, and then being thoughtful about the cross-cutting issues that you might need to create working groups around. So these are some common questions that we see. So if you had to say what are the kind of common things that we see with working group selection, these are the kind of science elements or things that you would see consistently. But there are also a lot of aspects of working group formation that's more the art, where you just need a sense where there's energy in the system and capitalize on where there are existing strong leaders and champions. So someone asked yesterday about, how do you take into account if there are existing collaborations already in place? So one thing that we've seen in communities is a lot of times they'll essentially use the existing energy in the community to form working groups that have in a lot of ways already been meeting, but then they provide a way for those working groups to coordinate across and to learn from each other. So a lot of times working group selection just comes down to, if you're, let's say specifically you want to work on cradle to career education in a certain city, well, maybe your working groups are going to be around things like improving out of school time mentoring, because there's already been a lot of work done in that space, and the nonprofits that are doing mentoring are already meeting, so let's have them be one of the work groups if there's already energy there. So that's kind of the art component of this, which is important. And just to give you a specific example, this was a community in Texas that created working groups around influencing childhood obesity. So they had identified that there were these multiple levels that you could impact childhood obesity, from social norms to primary and secondary leverage points, and then getting closer to the child where you've got behavioral settings and then the individual child themselves. And they basically used that framework to say, okay, where will working groups actually address and serve the collective impact effort? And so they created a working group around supportive healthcare systems, which was really engaging at the healthcare level, the land use transportation level, the public health level, and at the individual child level, the school and after school settings, which also touched multiple places in the system, healthy eating similarly touched in multiple places, physical activity, and then lastly, early childhood settings. So this was a visual way for them to say, if we're going to create all of these different action teams or working groups, how are they going to connect into the overall effort? And so this was essentially how they organized their work. They had a big goal, and then they had 5 working groups, which essentially had their own goals within them. I'm going to talk a little bit about evaluating collective impact, and then again, I'll pause to see if anyone has any questions as we dig into this detail. So it's important to think about evaluating collective impact on two levels. One is there's this broader term of evaluation which refers to the range of activities that you could do to determine how and what a collective impact initiative is accomplishing. And then within that, you could imagine that there would be a shared measurement system, which is essentially a common set of indicators that you would use to monitor an initiative's performance and track its progress. So there's often confusion. People will use these words interchangeably, but the big point here is that evaluation is a much broader term which has lots of different kind of tools and approaches and methods, one of which is a shared measurement system. And I'll describe this in a bit more detail, but just wanted to clarify that in terms of wording. So when you think about evaluating collective impact, one way to think about this is to look at progress across 4 different aspects of the work. So at one level, it's important to think about the collective impact initiative's context. And these are things like the community culture, the political context, the economic factors. There's a lot of things that just are kind of around an effort that you need to be aware of when you're evaluating a collective impact effort's effectiveness. So that's one level. Secondly, it's important to evaluate the collective impact initiative itself. And so these are things like how effectively are we moving forward on the 5 key conditions of collective impact, and are we actually taking time to learn? So there's things that you can do to understand how effective you are with the initiative itself. At a third level, it's also helpful to think about evaluating collective impact at the level of the systems that are targeted by the initiative. So these are things like, are you seeing individuals' behavior change? Are funding flows changing or norms shifting, or are there potentially policies that are changing? And then ultimately, you want to see that you're leading to population level outcomes and impact. This level 4 is certainly something that is going to take a long time to play out. People often want to jump straight to number 4, and what we like to say is that you really need to start by tracking 1, 2, and 3, and then ultimately you'll get to number 4. But it's a little bit mistaken to assume you can be tracking population level outcomes right away. So when you think about those 4 levels, so again, these are the 4 levels, and then put those kind of on a timeline from early to mid to late years of a collective impact. So think about these 4 categories and now overlay them onto a timeline. Essentially, the category 1, the context, is something that you would want to look at regardless of the stage. So from early, middle to year. Number 1 is kind of the box that encompasses all of the collective impact effort. And when we say early years, we typically mean years 1 to 2, middle years would be years 3 to 5, and late years is typically 5+ years out. It certainly you could get to quote unquote late years earlier than 5 years out, but this is a long-term process. So that first level really cuts across all the years. The second level, which again right here is on the left side of the slide, this is the collective impact initiative itself. And you could imagine in the early years of collective impact, this is really focusing on understanding how are we doing across those 5 key conditions. And so you see them here: common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, backbone, communication. There are things that you can do early on, even before you are seeing behavior change and before you're seeing population level impact, to say, have we actually reached agreement on a common agenda? And do we have backbone infrastructure in place? These are kind of foundational elements that you need to be making progress on before you can look at what's happening in the middle years. And then as you move from left to right here, you'll see that, with 3 and 4, these are the kind of behavior and system changes in the middle that ultimately lead to the ultimate outcomes on the far right. So this is just kind of a helpful visual that basically puts the last slide into a bit more context in terms of timing. I'm going to stop there again just to see if folks have any questions. We have about 20 minutes left, and I've got maybe 5 or 10 more minutes of content which I can go ahead and present, and then I will leave the last bit of time for questions. But given that I've shared a lot already, I'll pause for a moment right now and see if anyone has any questions either on this evaluation topic or any of the other earlier topics that I was speaking on.
Quite a few folks who are joining only on the computer, so they're not able to speak over the line. We'll give them a couple of extra moments to compose a chat question. So everyone, feel free to use the chat box to compose your question, and just shoot that off as soon as you get that in. If you don't have the, if you're not joining us on the conference call.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder. I'll definitely hold on for another couple of seconds. That's a great suggestion. And if questions come up as I'm talking, again, feel free to send them over and we can come back to them at the end. Great. I see a question here from Kristen Medlin. Yeah, what do you see as the role of higher education
institutions in collective impact initiatives? Kristen, it's a great question. I know that is probably top of mind for a lot of you on the line, given the roles that you all play, and many of you are university staff or administrators. I think they play a critical role. We looked at 2 examples yesterday, which I'm happy to send you more information on, or you can access the slides from yesterday. We looked at 2 specific examples where the university sector was definitely an active player at the table in an effort. One was around childhood obesity, and the other was around kind of cradle to career collective impact. And in both instances, the higher ed community was critical, both at a steering committee level as well as at a working group level. So I think that the answer is yes. It would be a huge miss if the university community was not engaged, particularly if it's issues where either there is resident kind of knowledge or expertise around a certain issue, or if it's actually critical to the issue itself beyond just expertise within certain departments. But you think about something like making sure that that kids graduate from high school, college, and career ready. It would be impossible to do that work well without thinking about what are the needs at the community college and four-year institution level, and making sure that those are reflected. So hopefully that helps you understand that it's definitely something where we see they play a critical role. And I think we also often see that universities, some are more out front and center as an actual vocal champion and helping initiate collective impact, whereas in other instances they're often brought along. Maybe they may not be the front and center champion, but they're often brought along pretty soon after, because it's recognized that they need to be at the table. There was just a meeting I was at a community in North Carolina. This was probably 4 months ago now, that was looking at issues around youth crime, and the local university in that community was actually the one that convened the initial meeting to determine, should we organize a collective impact effort here around youth crime. So in that instance, they were actually one of the critical players that actually brought the police department, the local funding community, the chamber, a whole host of leaders to decide, is this something we want to do? So this is great. And Kristen, I'm just looking at your follow-up here, and I'll read this out just so others can see this. Kristen says, we've been toying with this question at UNCG, asking questions like, can UNCG be a backbone? Degrees Matter is working as such with a professional staff member. And then as a follow-up, Kristen says, or could we have a role in evaluation of such initiatives given our focused resources, graduate programs? I'll take the latter half of that question first, Kristen. I think that's a great suggestion as you think about roles that universities can play. I think it could be a challenge if, for example, if you go back to I'm going back to this slide here. If you have it on your screen, if you were going to be brought in to evaluate this second category around the actual initiative itself, if the university was actually at the table in a leadership role, it might cause some confusion about, well, they're also evaluating the work. How can they do that as an unbiased voice? But if the university representation that's at the table from a leadership standpoint is different than the department that's evaluating it, then I think it could certainly work. And in the in the case of the childhood obesity work in Massachusetts, I know that they engage the university at multiple levels, both in a leadership capacity, but also in a research analytical capacity to understand the greatest needs in the community and how they were tracking in terms of addressing some of their metrics. And then to your question around whether the university could play the backbone role, it's a good question. I haven't seen many examples where a university completely takes on that role on its own, but I could imagine, particularly if you think about the different backbone functions, one of which is kind of data analysis and kind of the analytical piece, it feels like there's a lot of resident knowledge that would be within universities that could potentially play that role. And then this is similar to a question that Chad asked in terms of what organizations or institutions frequently take on the role of backbone. So hopefully that answered that, Chad. But in terms of other institutions that we see playing that role, it varies. I think we've seen United Ways often are interested in playing this role, but it's interesting because they sometimes wear both a funding and a backbone role, because they are often supporting organizations that are at the collective impact table. We've sometimes seen public sector entities step in to play that role, so it might be shared across multiple city or state level departments. So as an example, I was just at a conference last week hosted by Prevent Child Abuse North Carolina. So they're a nonprofit organization that works with child welfare agencies all over the state, but they've partnered with the North Carolina Department of Public Health to look into a statewide collective impact effort around child welfare. And in some ways, the backbone function is being shared between a state public agency, the Department of Public Health, and then this nonprofit entity. So in some ways, that's an example of kind of sharing the backbone role between two different organizations across two different sectors. Great question. Okay, I'll move on. I know we've only got 10 minutes left, so I'll just quickly touch on these last two topics, and then hopefully we'll have about 5 minutes at the end for any other questions that you have. But I'm glad you're asking questions along the way. It always makes for a more engaging conversation. So engaging the community, this is another important topic when you think about the how-to that it would be amiss if we didn't spend a little bit of time looking at this. So there's 5 reasons why you would want to engage the community with a collective impact effort. You first would want to better understand the different community challenges. Secondly, you would want to co-create solutions. So rather than just telling the community, here's the approach that we've come up with, you actually want them to help with problem solving and sharing their experience. Thirdly, it might be important to get the community's feedback on verifying the direction that you're going. So does this make sense? Are we missing anything? Fourth here is looking at how you expand the reach of strategies. So if you actually want these to be adopted in the community and not just be something that the steering committee and the working group is excited about, that's important. And then the 5th point here, it's often helpful to think about how you build the community's capacity to lead. So are there ways that you can train up the community to really be champions of the work and to share resources and learning across the community so that there is true buy-in and engagement, not just kind of tacit approval? So there's a spectrum that we've seen communities use, and we've adapted this from the Tamarack Institute, which I believe is also adapted from other community engagement experts, where you think about an increasing level of stakeholder engagement from inform to consult to involve, to collaborate, to co-lead. And as you think about collective impact and implementing collective impact, it's often helpful to use this framework in thinking about specific audiences and the level in which you want to engage them. Not everyone needs to be on the far right of the spectrum. This is not to imply that it goes from left to right as from bad to worse. It's just to state what it is, which is that some people you are going to want to be co-leading with. Others you might just need to inform, 4 times a year. So just being really clear about where do different community members, different leaders fall on the spectrum, and then how are you going to communicate with them. And this provides a bit more detail if you, again, use the same spectrum, but then think about the different engagement goals. These are the specific types of activities that you could do. So for example, if you wanted to, around engagement goal 1, if you wanted to understand system challenges, then at a more passive level, you might do surveys or interviews and consult with them. But on a much more active level, you might invite someone to join the steering committee. So in that instance, they would be co-leading. And as one more example, I won't speak through all of this, but if you wanted to, let's take engagement goal 5, if you wanted to build the community's capacity to lead, one way you could do that is through a proactive media campaign or community training, which would help inform the community. Or there might be something in the middle where you actually want to involve people in a more proactive way, where you actually might enlist the community as spokespeople or do somewhat of a train-the-trainer. Maybe 2 more minutes on the role of funders, and then I'll pause again for the last maybe 5 minutes for any final questions. So the role of funders, I spend a lot of my day thinking about this. In my role with the Collective Impact Forum, I spend probably 80% of my time now working with funders through a community of practice. This is a group that's meeting throughout the year to meet with funder peers to learn from each other around collective impact. So these are concepts that are near and dear to my heart, so I'll just speak to them very briefly. So there's different ways that funders can be involved in collective impact. One is that they can amplify impact, and this is an important role where you think about how they can bring kind of a long-term systemic change view to the work. Secondly, they can increase the efficiency of resources. This is an important role that funders can play in terms of aligning funding or opening channels for new funding. And then there's also this important point around driving alignment. So finding ways to reduce duplication of services and increase coordination. There's just an important role that funders can play in terms of signaling that this is a different way of doing business, and it starts with how funders operate differently themselves, but then it can also play out in terms of how they signal that their grantees could operate differently and other partners. And we often see funders working together to support collective impact in several ways. So we've seen communities create a funder advisory group where either funders have their own essentially work group, or you have funders sitting on that overall steering committee. So that's one approach. We've often seen funders coordinate their investments on common agenda priorities. So you could take the childhood obesity example, for example. If there was a common agenda around reducing childhood obesity, you could imagine funders basically getting on the same page in terms of how they could coordinate investments around that. This third approach is, as you think about moving down on the list here, these get more and more coordinated and more intentional. So co-invest in infrastructure. So this is where you might actually have funders investing in a backbone leader or a backbone organization, or maybe putting the money into a shared measurement system for gathering data if it doesn't exist. And then lastly, this is less common, but there are a couple examples that I know of where communities have actually created pooled funds of resources that are used specifically to get collective impact activities launched or to support collective impact infrastructure over time. So I'll stop there. I know we're almost at time, but I went a little bit longer because we've had questions along the way, which is great. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you all again for the second day, and I'll stop there and see if there are any final questions that people are welcome to type into the webinar platform, or you're also welcome to unmute your line if you have called in to ask a question or two. Great. Chad asked a question, which I'll read back out to everyone who isn't on the webinar. Can you comment on the tension between a funder's desire for impact evidence and the length of time needed to get to the point where you can assess those impacts? I think it's one of the biggest tension points that we see, Chad. Just last week, I did a role play exercise where I was helping a community kind of understand some of the tensions around collective impact, and when we did a debrief afterwards, this came up front and center. We had people wear different hats, wear different roles, and the person who was wearing the funder role said that they were impatient during the exercise because they felt like it was just a lot of talking and there wasn't a lot of direct impact coming out of the work. So I think the way to balance that is to identify some quick wins and some things that you can point to early on where you are starting to see some change. And if you go back to that earlier slide where we talked about evaluating collective impact at multiple levels, one way to address the concern about kind of length of time needed to get to impact is that you should be able to show pretty early on that you're seeing some changes in the process of how you're working together. And it shouldn't take you that long to begin to see behavior change. And those are things that you can communicate to a funder sooner and say that this is the link and the kind of assumptions that we're making, that if we see progress in these interim steps, it will lead to ultimate impact. And that's often a helpful way to kind of bridge that gap between funders who say, well, I want to see results on a 12-month grant timeline, but unfortunately, that just is not how complex social change happens. And with collective impact, it's going to be a multi-year process. It doesn't mean that you defer all measurement and evaluation for multiple years. It's just being thoughtful about what you communicate and when. Great. I've got time for maybe one more question, or we'll give you 1 minute back. Any other final questions?
Okay, well, it's been a pleasure these past 2 days, and if you have any questions, my email is here on this slide, and I would encourage you all to sign up. It's a free sign-up at collectiveimpactforum.org if you want to stay in the loop on the different resources and blog posts and discussion threads that are available on the website. So, Chad, thank you again, and Leslie, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Robert. Before I let you go, I want you to have a chance to tell folks about the Collective Impact Forum and whether they can join that forum and who that's open to. And I also want to encourage everyone to follow the link that I'm pasting in the chat box to our webinar evaluation. It's the same evaluation that you completed yesterday. You'll just select today's presentation and share your feedback with us. So, Robert, can you just make sure you let people know whether they can join the forum and who that's designed?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't give more context on the front end, but just to give you the 30-second version now. So the Collective
Forum is a free online membership, so certainly everyone is welcome to sign up. We actually just crossed the 10,000 member mark 2 nights ago, which was really exciting. The website's only been up for about 11 months and essentially launched to help with sharing of knowledge and resources around collective impact. So we have a lot of resources that FSG and our partners at the United Way and Forum for Youth Investment and others have gathered over the past couple of years around best practices in collective impact. So one big thing we do is we organize a lot of online discussions and resources. And then the second thing we do is we organize convenings and trainings throughout the year particularly for backbone leaders and for funders. And so it's a combination of an online site and then a series of trainings that you all are certainly welcome to come to particularly if you see yourself wearing that funder or backbone hat. And there's more details online. Bye, everybody.
Everyone, if you're still on the computer and listening through your speakers, I just wanted to remind you that the next session is Tuesday, March 17th at 1 p.m. We'll be looking at a couple of collective impact models that are taking place right here in North Carolina. So we hope you'll be able to join us for that session. And I apologize for any trouble with the audio there at the very end of the session. We're still kind of working out multiple speakers on both the conference call and the computer, but we'll get it squared away. Please share your feedback with us in the evaluation. You can follow the link that I pasted into the chat box, and we hope you'll join us next time. Bye.